I'm Megan.
I'm CJ.
And I'm Erica.
And this is the Her Podcast.
All right, guys, we are so excited to talk with our friend Lisa Greig today. Lisa is a social worker by trade and a professional student by choice. You guys, this episode is so great. We highlight and talk about all things grief, what it's like to experience grief. How do you come alongside someone who's just had something happen in their life? There's so many good takeaways, so many good tips from Lisa. We cannot wait for you guys to hear everything about it. So turn up that volume and take a listen.
Oh, you're getting right in there.
Cuddled.
Okay.
Sorry, my socks are ugly though.
Welcome to Erica's
Do you have pedicured feet?
I do, but you know my toes are weird.
All of a sudden, we have like foot fetish people following us.
Do you
Make
know what,
extra
though? You
money.
can make a lot of sponsorship. Let's get that globe. Show your feet.
Yeah, make some extra money on the side.
Have a foot Patreon.
People love that stuff.
Just socks with like one hole in it. So just one toe is coming out.
Like as the episode goes on, more toes come out.
Yeah.
So it's like a slow reveal.
And to get the full reveal, you have to pay money.
You have to keep watching. There's a new level you can unlock every time.
Lisa, I'm on the edge of my seat. This is so great.
I'm like, there's a business model here.
How can we monetize the feet?
My feet.
So we're just going to jump right in.
Good.
And we want to get to know you, and we want our audience to get to know you.
Okay.
And you tell us how you got to where you are in your work. What made you feel pulled to focus on grief?
Oh, I was like, oh God, what work are you talking about? Do you know what? It was instilled in me right from childhood. So my mom worked as a home health aide for her career, always like really pulled into the work of palliative care. So the conversations of death and dying were just like normalized in our home, around our dinner table, with our pets. Like it was just something that we talked about. And then from there, when I went into social work, it was like, I want medical social work. I want grief and loss. Was matched up in, the universe's way of these two incredible mentors who that was always their focus. And then honestly, you start doing the work and it's the most like humbling and rewarding and just moving experience when you just are on people in their grief journey. And so it was just like, it's so weird to be like, oh, I don't want to be like, oh, it was so rewarding for me. I'm not some like ambulance chaser by any means. But it's just like the work is so like life confirming.
What do you mean by life confirming?
Well, I think when you sit in grief, which is like so many endings, so much sadness, so much sorrow, I think the counter to that is joy, gratitude, happiness. And so when you're sitting in loss with people, it really makes you have to focus in on what you appreciate and what you value and what you have. And I mean, you're with these people as they're saying goodbye or have said goodbye to the most important people. And that's just death loss, let alone, oh my gosh, divorce, illness, ability, this pandemic, so much loss every day.
So, so my question is, because you're talking about this, I'm like trying to envision what you do because I'm very visual. So are you like pairing up with the hospitals and working on like palliative care units? Are you like, I have my own, like, how does that look for you? Like your own practice that people are like booking in to come and talk about their grief?
So it is totally evolved over the years. So absolutely it started as a social worker in the health region when I lived in Regina. Then I was like bereavement counselor for a bereavement center in Regina. And then I come up to Saskatoon and I did some work in a treatment facility for youth. So you can just imagine the complex grief there. And then it's evolved. Like now I'm in higher education. And that's like where my, my full-time job is, and it's rewarding and I love students. And, a couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to start a grief group for students on campus just because they're coming in with loss and their peers don't understand it. And now it's just really meshed into this world of like, I want to talk about it or share about it. And it's quite informal. So I do some consulting for Prairie Hospice in the city or for the hospice at Glengarda now. I'm going to help them launch a volunteer program. So that's on the side. And then wrote the children's book on grief because it just lived inside of my head, volunteering at a grief camp for kids. And so it's not like I don't do grief for a full-time job. It's just always found ways into wherever I'm at in my life. As a way of kind of service and employment. And so I've just had these amazing opportunities that have always, come for me, but I've also, I guess, sought out in a way.
So I'm curious, how would we define grief? I don't know if there's like a physical definition, right? But I'm like, it's just in my mind, it feels like this understandable term, but also very ambiguous.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like
And I'm
open-ended almost.
Are there categories of grief, right? Which you kind of touched on to mention. And then how would you define it?
I think it's Jack Jordan who, like, my favorite definition, where like grief is like the universal experience of loss to anything that we are psychologically attached.
Oh.
And I love that because, we're psychologically attached. So it's not about it has to be like necessarily a living object, but also that includes pets, people, relationships, physical ability, right? Anybody who, we're such an ableist society. So anybody who's experienced, from one way of doing to the next, so much grief is in that. Changing of relationships. I work in higher education. So not everyone gets their happily ever after from their first partner.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so those, so that psychological attachment and that loss is what I think. And then as for the categories, people always want categories almost for a hierarchy.
Yes.
So it's like, oh, my
That's
grief is worse
interesting.
than your grief.
Right.
Or
Comparison.
and like, hard is freaking hard.
Yeah.
That's it. Hard is hard.
Well, and I know, like, my sisters and I were talking about it recently, because I'm like, I find that concept, I'm like agreeing with you. The idea of being like, my heart is worse than your heart. And I'm like, but what if that hard is the only thing you've ever experienced? Then to you, it's devastating. And some people might have something hard happen to them, and they're like, from the outside, people are like, that's wild. And it's like, well, it's okay. Right. Like it's so person based. So I find the idea of grief to be kind of like CJ, kind of ambiguous, because I'm like, there's so much fluidity to it on like what it can look like and how it can feel.
Yes.
Well, and like experience based too. Right. Like you mentioned, grieving the loss of a relationship. That does not mean that somebody died.
Yeah. Divorce.
Divorce means you are now grieving the life that you anticipated that you would have.
Yes.
As well.
So much.
And navigating that, I'm so curious how, and loss of friendships, or, divorcing your friends. Like people talk about stuff like that too, or loss of a job, or loss of a, opportunity that you were psychologically tied to or emotionally invested in, if that's fair to say as well. So how do people navigate those kind of losses when we often associate grief with death and dying?
Right.
Right.
One, we talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's Dr. Dan Siegel that, you have to name it to tame it. And so first and foremost, you have to name it. And I think more often than not, sitting in a space with people when they're just talking about like whatever emotion or feeling that's bubbling up for them. And when you go like, it sounds like you're grieving something. And they're like, oh my God, I am. And it's like, yeah, you're allowed to. It doesn't have to be death. Like you're allowed to grieve whatever it is. And it's that same concept of trauma. Like who am I to tell someone that their experience was traumatic for them or not? It's going to be different for everyone. Right. And that's grief too. It's like some people will find, I have a friend who's going through a divorce right now who's experienced significant death loss. And he said to me, he's like, at least with the death losses, there was finality and closure.
That's exactly what it is.
Right. And he goes,
Yes.
and he's like, we're versus the divorce. Like there's no closure. I have to continue with that. And that's hard for him versus some people. It's not like it's so complicated.
What I find interesting in my own life when I think about grief and when I think about like the things that I find really difficult is I'm like, I actually would almost find death easier in a sense. Cause I'm, when I think about like a divorce or friendships or people who choose to leave your life, I'm like, they weren't choosing to leave me. Something happened that caused that. And that almost like closure of like, and I'm a faith believing person. So I'm like, okay, so I believe in like, heaven. So I can even equate to being like, oh, well, they're in heaven. Whereas if someone like chooses to leave you, you're like, well, now I'm abandoned.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm
rejection's
rejected. Right. And so I find that very interesting.
I remember saying to people, because long before I met my current partner, I went through a marriage and divorce as well. And I remember saying, I feel like it would be easier if he had died. That would have been easier for me.
Yeah.
Than to grieve the loss of what I thought my life was going to be like, what, that picture that you had in your head and this living person that you still have to grieve, this person and the loss and the relationship and like all of the things that come with it, thinking like, I wish that, just like you had said, there would have been a finality there.
Yes.
Well, and there's something to be said about when you can look at a situation and go, there's nothing I could have done. Right? But when people are making choices, you're like, what could I have done to persuaded that choice? What could I have done to change this? Or did I act in a way, right? But if someone gets sick and passes away, it's like nothing I could have done could have like stopped that timeline from happening.
But that still doesn't bring comfort
No.
for those in grief.
Right, absolutely.
And I think
True.
that's like, that is what we have to remember, right? Is like, you know, we will always rationalize and understand from our place of
Yes.
being, right? And it's
Yes.
like, oh, I think I could, or I think I couldn't, or this. And the end of the day, you don't know until you're in
Yeah.
it. And I think that's like where we say like the best thing we can do for grief is acknowledge it. And so many times we're trying to like gratitude people's hard emotions away, and we at least them, and we shit all over them, and you know, at least you had this time, or you know, whatever that is. And even for those, like if you're faith-based, like at least they're in a better place now. Like, no, we can't. We just have to acknowledge the pain for what it is.
So how do you do that? Like, I'm curious on, as like, again, someone in my life, like I've been very blessed. I haven't experienced really any loss when it comes to life or anything like that. So my curiosity is, how do you be a support person?
First, like you walk alongside them, right? It's not about like a head or behind, but it's simply like you sit with them in their pain, and that is so freaking uncomfortable, right? We hate other people's pain. We hate discomfort. We like repel from it. We want to fix it. We want to make it better. We want to serve it up some casseroles, because that's what we take to everyone when someone's experienced a loss. But you just have to sit in it and acknowledge their pain for what it is, for what they say it is. Like, we are the experts in our own everything, actually.
Yeah.
In our lived experiences, we are our own experts. And so if you want to support someone, just like listen and trust them for what they're telling you. And I think we're so quick to like interrupt, to be like, oh my gosh, yes. And like this one time, my aunt's cousin's sister's dad's hamster died, and it was so
To
hard.
relate.
You know, and we're trying to relate.
Yeah.
But like, I think at the end of the day, I mean, I'm sorry, but when someone's in the deepest pain of their life, like, I don't like, do I want to relate to that? Like, no, I don't. You know,
Right.
that's, so we need to acknowledge that for what it is, versus, which is like, that's just so like, that's so, I mean, shitty, crappy. I don't know if I can swear.
Yes.
Okay. I'm like, oh, I'm just trying to be very PG. But like, you know, that's so shitty.
Yeah.
So sorry, I want to interrupt because
Yeah.
again, I'm visual. So are you suggesting like literally sitting with them and just letting, like, even if that's like quiet, if it's hearing their words, if it's just like echoing back their pain to them and being like, yes, this does suck.
Our pain needs to be acknowledged.
Okay.
Right.
Right. So when someone's like, oh my gosh, I just can't believe it. I can't believe it. Like, you can just be like, this is awful. And like one of the best things I heard from, you know, and I mean, while there is no hierarchy to like grief and especially death loss, like I will say the death of a child is the club that nobody wants to be in.
Yeah.
And
I
I will, like, that
imagine.
is
Can't even.
when it's like the worst of the worst. Fortunately, I have not lived through that. I hope I never do. That is what we call an out of order death. And so I always just want to acknowledge that one is like,
Yeah.
ooh.
Big.
And it's like when people say, you know, I can't imagine how hard this is. It was like a mom had said to me, it's actually like, you don't want to imagine how
Yeah.
hard this is. And I'm like, that's so true. And even just acknowledging that, right? Where it's like, I don't even want to imagine how hard this is. No. Like, this is like the worst of the worst. Or, you know, when somebody's going through that divorce, rather than being like, you know what, like, you're so better off. He or she they didn't treat you like how you deserved. Or, you know, I know there's somebody better out there for you. Like, shut up.
Yeah.
Like, just let them be in the, like, it's like, oh my God, this sucks. Like, this is not what you had pictured for yourself.
So how do you suggest supporting people in their grief who do not want to let anybody in or don't want to talk about anything or at a place where they're very angry and have gone inside? Like, what are some tips to navigate that as somebody who cares for that person going through it?
I mean, first of all, patience.
Right.
And then second of all, it's who's the discomfort about? right? Am I uncomfortable
okay.
because of their anger?
Right.
Am I uncomfortable because of their silence? Am I uncomfortable because of their change in personality? More likely than not, I am.
Right.
Right. But we do, again, especially like in that urgent, like immediate, or even, I mean, oh my gosh, that first year, like we just have to ride the waves with them. And like, they need to know that when they're ready to talk, we're there, not on our terms, on their terms.
Yeah.
Right. And that's very different than when we set the agenda, or when we're like, oh, you know, they've been like so isolated. We really need to get them out. Okay. So like, ring up the girls group chat. Like, we are getting her out on the town tonight. And it's like, maybe she doesn't want that.
Right.
And maybe she wants a quiet night in. Maybe all of that's overwhelming. Maybe the emotions, like hyper stimulation, right?
Yeah.
You know, we've been there. And if you've experienced any type of loss in your life, like really dial into like what you needed versus maybe what other people thought you needed. And I mean, there's also the societal norms of like very gendered approaches to grief, right?
Ooh, let's dig into that.
Right. Women are supposed to be the feelers. Men are supposed to be the fixers. And again, gender is very fluid in my opinion. So I'm just like saying the societal norms, not my beliefs. But that masculine, feminine way of grieving, when the reality is we constantly move between the two. Constantly. Like, so one time we're going to be in the emotions, and then we're going to, you know, we're just going to oscillate between the doing and the feeling. And sometimes that oscillation will stay stuck, right? And if we're stuck in the feeling and now we can't do, meaning maybe I have children that I need to get to school, right? That's hard, right? That's hard.
Yeah.
Or when I'm stuck in the doing and now I'm avoiding feeling. That's hard.
Yeah.
And that's where like people just need to support you through it. And I mean, of course I'm going to sit here and be like, also therapy. Like,
yes.
You need people who aren't emotionally invested in your life to also support you on the outside, that are like trained and educated in sitting with you.
Well, because I think we can't avoid, maybe this is a really blanket statement and I've never thought of it before this, so let's go down this road.
I love it.
Like, we can't avoid motive.
Right.
Like, I'm like, even when I love you and I want the very best for you, right? Like, my opinions will come from that place.
Yeah.
So my motive might be like, I want you to have a good life. And not that it's a bad motive, but you can't avoid motive.
Intent and
But
impact.
it's still your motive.
It's still my motive.
Right.
Yep.
So, you know, you go to a therapist too. And I always said, like, I go to therapy and I'm like, my therapist obviously cares for me, like, as a therapist. But I'm like, she doesn't really like...
Her life goes on.
Like, her life goes on. Like, it's
right.
I'm not, you know, so I think there's so much value to sitting down with someone who really has no opinion of you.
Yeah.
And is really just like, I'm going to take what you're saying at face value, talk with you about it, and like figure that out, and then send you on your way.
Yeah.
And like, yes, they hope for the best for you, but
Well, probably a safe place to get out some of those feelings, right?
Oh,
because
yeah.
sometimes probably those closest to us almost can't handle at times the true depth of what we're feeling.
Right. And like, especially as women, I don't like, come on, we edit ourselves too.
Yeah, 100%.
We're so fearful of judgment and
Yep.
comparison and wanting to be perceived a certain way. So like
Yeah.
when we're in our shittiest place, we're like, no, I'm fine. I'm good. I'm really good. And the narrator's like, she is not fine.
Yeah.
You know, but like,
We can all see it.
Yeah.
right. And, but then as friends, you're like, I don't really want to like say, ooh. And like so much of like, you know, any of the grief journeys I've been on, like in some ways felt so parallel to my postpartum journey.
Yes.
You know, where you're just like kind of isolated, kind of trapped, supposed to, you know, not showered, not eating properly,
Yes.
not caring for yourself, don't want to leave the house. Like, you know, yes, postpartum depression too. Everyone's
Yeah.
like, oh, that girl sounds like she was struggling. Of course I
Yes.
was. But
So
like,
did I.
But, you know, but there's so many parallels I find with that in that grief piece too, where it's like, oh, do you know what? Like the best things for me in that time weren't the person showing up being like, okay, Lisa, shower, let's get out of the house. We're going for a walk.
Oh yeah, I would have been like,
Right. It was
right?
like, I'll come sit with you. And like, while I was sitting holding my baby, they would wash the dishes.
Mm-hmm.
So then I felt like, oh, calm baby, house being cleaned. It's all being done at the same time. You know, and so it's those tasks that were valuable to me.
Practical.
Basic.
Every day.
Right.
Small.
And
simple.
Just, right. Simple, but not making me change what it was I wanted to do. It's like, you know, when you think about having that new baby and people are like, oh, give me your baby, you go nap. Well, I'm sorry. Like my brain was not wired just to go nap.
Here you go.
Right.
Yeah.
Versus like, oh, I could just like rest and hold the baby well, other things are being done, or I had some company, or now the baby's fussy. Like, if you want to shower, I will deal with the baby while you can go shower if you want to do that.
That's great advice.
Right. And that was so helpful. And I think when you take grief on that journey too, it's like, you know, just because it's sad and uncomfortable versus like postpartum is supposed to be exciting and beautiful. It's like, just, they're the expert. Check in. What do they need and want? And if they're like, I don't know what I need, sit down, but don't make them entertain you.
Yeah, no, that's not nice, right?
No.
Selfishly, I have a question about grief. I mean, so two things. Like, one, grief probably doesn't follow a timeline.
No.
Right? And so it has its own timeline, and I'm curious on your thoughts on that. And the other thing is when you're in relationship with someone where you're experiencing a constant grief. So, for example, my father-in-law was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And so we're having constant little deaths every day, right? A loss of that ability. And so, again, similar to like having a more concrete death, right? Compared to these small little losses that feel like little cuts every day that you're slowly bleeding out, right? And I'm like curious what your tips would be on handling a grief that is more long lasting and even just timelines.
Timelines. I'm like, oh, if there was a way to put grief into a timeline or into stages, like grief is not in stages, right? That's the whole, first of all, like that myth of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of grief.
Interesting.
That was a study done on the stages of dying, not on grief. And they found that people who were dying would follow typically in those stages, which was then taken into, you know, we love to like pathologize and put things into boxes. I certainly do. And so then that was taken out of context and like, you know, we follow these stages. When in fact, I mean, they're very common symptoms and experiences. We all move through them, but we don't move through all of them. We may move through none of them. We may skip through them, but it's like a cycle. Oops. See, I'm a hand talker.
That's okay.
You know, but like we just are constantly, you know, moving through them and going, it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Like, you know, when you think about the waves, like that is just what our grief is. It's not stages.
That's a beautiful picture. The waves.
The waves, right? And so some days it's like a freaking tsunami.
Yeah.
And then some days.
Amen.
And then some days it's
calm.
Yeah.
You know, like it's just chill.
I saw this image once, and again, I know we don't want to be like trying to paint a picture of grief, but it was this like almost like ripple effect, and it was like a person in the middle with these like circles around, and it was like showing, it was like year 1, and it was like this giant circle of grief around them, and it was like everything affects them, everything hurts. And then it was like, you know, year 5, and the circle was like a little bit smaller, and it kind of went through this all the way down till the circle was just in the person, and it was like it never leaves.
No.
But the points of impact might become smaller, like things like Christmases might get easier or whatever, you know, those little moments might get easier, but the grief will always be there. And I really liked that because and again, I'm not like an expert, and I'm not like, don't have tons of experience, as I've said, but I'm like, I can understand that picture of like, it always stays with you. Yeah. But maybe the triggers dull themselves a little bit, or you start to cope with the triggers differently, right?
And like Erica, it's this very similar, there's like a ball in the box analogy. And they talk about if you took a box and you put a ball in it, and then there's like a pain trigger, like a button on the side. And you know, the initially with your grief, like the ball basically takes up the whole box. So every time you're walking through the box, if you move it, that ball hits the pain trigger, right? Over time, the ball gets smaller. So you can move the box and the pain trigger won't get hit every single time. Yeah. Right. Which is exactly, you know, what you were saying. And the other thing with grief is like, I always like to say it gets lighter, not easier. Right? Because it's always hard. It's always hard. When it bubbles up, grief will always be hard. But it gets lighter, and it gets lighter when we allow others to help us carry it. And so if we can share our story, that's like, if you can talk, and when there's like the disenfranchised grief. And so that can just...
What do you mean by disenfranchised?
What is that?
Like it's like the grief without a home. It's like you know, the griefs of like that we don't talk about, stigma associated grief. You know, even people who like, I mean, I'm not somebody, you know, who identifies as trans, but even like that gender affirming surgery, we may assume that they grieve, but maybe they don't. But there's also so much that can go with that, right? And that's disenfranchised, because who else wants to talk about it? Who else is safe to talk about that
see.
with? Where does that get to go about, you know, the grief of spending so much of their life not getting to live into who they truly were? Who gets to talk about that?
So essentially anything where we'd be like, we don't have a place for it.
You don't
like
have a
we
place
can't
for it.
label it under like death grief or
society doesn't accept it.
okay.
You know, reading so much of the work of Esther Perel, who's like a relational expert, and like, you know, talking about relationships with like, you know, maybe there are, you know, affairs, and we're talking about like the kissing boyfriends. Something happens. You don't get to talk about that loss or that ending, right? Where do you go with that? And I mean, people have their own opinions and judgments on that, but that's still disenfranchised grief if we're going to really name what happens out in the world, right? And it's just hard to talk about. And just any type of grief that like we downplay, like even for our kids, like a friend moving away.
Yeah.
Like by no means is that like disenfranchised on the scale, but if we're just like, no, you'll make new friends.
Minimize it.
Downplaying.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we have to like, we just have to sit in the hard, and we have to just be like, oh, if that's hard for you, that's hard. I trust you on your life and your opinions.
So how do you get someone to acknowledge, like, do you ever come across people who are clearly going through grief and like won't name it, won't acknowledge it, won't, or, you know, like, how do you, I'm just curious on that, if, cause like, you know, some people who are just like, no, I'm fine. Like, it's good.
Yeah.
Like, how do you work through with someone
Or help them carry it?
yeah, like I'm curious on what that looks like.
I like one, I just like, especially when I used to work with teenagers, I'm like, you can be fine, but you have to be fine and. So fine and give me another word.
Okay.
Because fine is like, meh. It's like, how are you? I like this. It's like, I'm fine. It's like, meanwhile, it's like, she's not fine.
Yeah.
Fine means like, it's like, oh my gosh, if your partner's like, oh yeah, you look fine.
Just fine?
Just fine.
What's
Right,
that
that's the
movie?
best.
It's like fragile, insecure, neurotic, and emotional.
What? I've never heard that before.
I think I'm getting it a little wrong, but I think it's from the Italian Job.
Oh my God.
That's amazing.
The things that stick with you from movies,
Fragile,
right?
insecure, neurotic.
Right. But it's
Okay.
right. So it's like fine and, you know, I'm not ever going to sit there and say, and someone's like, oh, I'm just like really struggling. And I'm like, no, actually you're grieving.
Yeah.
Like, stop. I don't need to, versus someone who's like, I just don't understand why this is so hard for me. Like, why is this so hard? And that's when I can be like, because it's a loss. It's a loss of what you thought things were going to be. You thought you were going to get that job and you had plans for that salary increase. And, you know, you had that house, you put an offer on a house that you didn't get.
Yeah.
You had built your life in that home. Like, and you're like, I know, but like, I should be so grateful still. And that's where I'm like, you get to be both and.
Yeah.
Grieving and grateful, happy and sad. Like, we don't have to just pick one lane and stay in it. I mean, stay in our own lanes.
Yes.
But like when it comes to emotions,
Emotional lanes.
you know, like you both and that's the big one for me is like we can't just like gratitude our way out of that grief hole. Like we have to just sit in it first and then go like, no, I still have all of these wonderful things and I get to be so freaking sad right now. Right?
Do you advise people to sit in things for a certain amount of time or is it like, you know, because I will feel my feelings. I'm like, okay, I felt sad the other day. And instead of being like, but I get to do this, I get to go here, like the weekend's going to be really fun. I was like, I just feel sad. I'm going to feel sad and then I'll move through it. But I kind of sometimes I'm like, I'll feel sad today. But this is not a big grief loss, right? Like it's just the emotion. So is there like a, you know, is it open-ended or do you say, sit in it for this week and then let's talk about finding one thing that's, you know, you can look forward to or do one thing for yourself? Or are there, what do you suggest?
I'm like, it's so open-ended. Like, I just think we're so quick to like make people move through it at our pace, not at theirs.
Because it makes us uncomfortable.
Because it makes us uncomfortable. And I think, again, like it's one thing if someone's like, you know, at risk of losing their job, not paying, like, so then how do we support them
Right.
in getting this time? Or like, what are we doing? Like, this is where that community care piece comes in, where like, it's so individualistic, where people are like looking out for themselves. Like, how do we help them in this? But like, they've got to feel their emotions. And my friend Adrienne at her book launch did the best story about parenting with kids and how we always like rush them back into things. And she's talking about her daughter at basketball got hurt. normally you'd come off and you'd dust your kid off and you'd be like, okay, get back on the court, go back and do this thing. And instead she took a page out of whatever parenting book and was like, you know what? You tell me when you're ready.
Oh, okay.
And if you're not ready to go back and you're not ready, but you tell me when you're ready, and sat with her in this. And then it was like not that long. And all of a sudden she goes, okay, Mom, I'm ready.
Yeah.
And away she went.
And what a shift
How healing.
that's making
Right?
for that child to own and realize when she's ready for things.
And I mean, that just leads into the conversations of like consent and autonomy and empowerment. But it's like, that's it. It's like, you know what? You like, tell me when you're ready. I'm here. Just tell me when you're ready. And I think we would be surprised if we actually allowed people that time to say that they're ready. They're
Because
going
maybe
to be
that's
ready.
all we want.
Right.
Inside of ourselves is to be given that time.
Right.
And once you're given it, you're like, oh, it might not take as long as we originally thought.
Or like, don't we all want control?
I was going to say choice because then you're in choice, but we do all want control.
We do. Like, so when someone says, hey, like, you know, everything else in your life was out of control, but you get to control this. It's like parenting 101, right?
Right.
Where like, do you want to wear this or this, buddy? He thinks he's a choice, but like, I've picked out the outfit. You know, but it's the same thing.
I do the same thing with Nick. It's okay.
Right? It's like, oh, you give outfits. You give choice.
I'm just kidding. Yeah, Nick actually gets no
Not
choice.
to your
It's
husband.
like, and
to
the
your
outfit
kids.
is on the bed.
I was going to say.
And then he's still like, I'm going to wear what I'm wearing already.
they go back in the closet and you're like, no.
It's like, no, I nailed this. Like, it's like, you do not choose outfits for family photos.
That's for the mom for sure.
Hands off.
I can tell when Nick wants to make me really happy because he'll come out and go,
Yep.
okay, what am I wearing? Because he knows like I'm really dressed up. And then he's like, I need to match her. I can tell I need to match her
Then he's
energy
like,
today.
shit.
He's like, oh, she's
So this is like a not hat event.
Not had
like,
I have to do
Can
my
I wear?
hair.
Am I allowed to wear anything that says Farming or West Screen or like whatever else on it? Right? I'm like,
Am I allowed to wear a promotional item that was gifted
that
to
was
me?
gifted in a swag bag. No.
No.
So because we're talking about children, you wrote a children's book on grief.
I did.
So how did that come up for you?
Oh, you know, this is like, you talk about the gifts of the pandemic when you have like extra time to sit inside of your own head.
Right.
Yeah.
Good and bad. But you know, I've always wanted to write a book. I do want to write a book. I don't know what that's going to be, whatever. And this is just something that kind of bubbled up first. It's like, you know, our girl Oprah and talking about listening to the whispers to get all woo woo. And it's
Love
just
that.
like, you know, it was just there. Like, I'm like a children's book, and then rhyming, because of course when you read these books to kids, I'm like, I want it to be easy to read.
And fun.
Right, fun. I
Memorable.
hate when my kid brings me the novel before bed. I'm like, this is not efficient. But also, like, and I really wrote it with like teachers in mind. Because I felt like the loss that they go through in their classrooms, I thought, like, what would be something that a teacher or somebody like in front of a group could just do with a class? And like in the book, it talks about like, you know, having each person like name their emotion and how it moves through their body. And I thought it would just be like a fun activity to give our teachers the tools to just do something when they've experienced, or a kid in their class experiences a loss. So like, that's really the space that I wrote it from. And then just like putting it together, and then thanks to, you know, the great resource that is Canva, I actually just like found some things that I liked, that I mapped out, and then I found the original author of a cartoon I liked, and then I found her via like Etsy. She lives in the Ukraine, and like this is like years ago, and I was like, hey, I really liked what you designed for Canva, but like I want you to design something for me. Can we change it up?
Oh, cool.
It was like this, like, yeah, talk about like this
love
like
that.
treasure hunt.
Serendipity. Yeah. Like this little
It
adventure.
was a little adventure.
cool.
And I wanted it simple. Like, you know,
Yeah.
I wanted to keep it very, very simple. I think grief is complex enough.
Right.
So you just keep it simple. I wanted the bunny to be androgynous. I didn't want it to be gendered anything, just a bunny. And then just talking about our emotions and like feeling our body. I just wanted to normalize it. I wanted a book that could go into libraries, classrooms, and homes, to sit on a shelf, to be like, we don't have to just bring this out when someone dies. We can just bring this out for anything.
Normalize
We
it.
can just normalize it.
I love that you really touch on like the body sensations and having a tool to help children understand that at a young age, because I'm still understanding and
Right.
working on like, hey, I'm feeling this in my body. what does that mean for me right now?
Right.
Instead of being like, oh, like associating it with an emotion. It might be a body sensation. It might be part of the emotion.
Right. Or like with kids when it's like, oh, I see you're mad. Let's talk about what you're sad about.
Yeah.
Right. Because again, Dan Siegel, mad is sad's bodyguard. And so it's like, let's, and that's, that sadness piece. And like, where is it working through? Where do we feel it in our hands or our tummies or our heads? And, again, as adults, like, I think we need that. Like, I need someone to sit with me and be like, okay, Lisa, you're a little bit triggered today. Like, let's talk about in our body where you're having feelings. I mean, my husband better not start doing that to me. I'll be like,
excuse me?
But just like to start paying
That
attention.
could go a whole different direction.
Yeah.
All right.
Play a fun game.
You never know.
See? Grief can be fun. But like, where we know, it's that noticing piece, right? Like we have to start like paying attention and noticing where do these emotions live.
And that requires us to pause.
Oh,
which is uncomfortable.
Isn't it?
And in this society, we're very rush, push through, move through. So even just sometimes taking a day off and doing nothing is uncomfortable, right? So to sit in your emotions, that's uncomfortable.
But
so
like,
learning
do we
that
take
pause.
a day off, or do we just
mean-
busy ourselves like right into being?
Or are we doing laundry?
I have just started taking an actual day off.
Yes,
I
CJ
think
does.
I've talked about it, but
Yes.
I like full electronics off, full 24 hours, just like unplugged with my husband or whoever's in my home. And it's life
But
changing.
I love how you shared that and you talked about that, because I think it's like, it also gives permission for other people to be like, wait a second, we don't have to be like on call for everybody.
No. Absolutely.
We have to, and I mean, through all of these hard emotions, and I know that this is grief focused, but like the other side around is like, grief is just a part of life. Like that's what this is about. It's about living and living with our grief and, how it impacts how we do things. And that is like one thing where it's like, when I die, am I really going to be like, oh my God, remember that one post that got like 200 likes?
No, when I like to think when we die, Instagram becomes a thing we never have to think about again.
Oh my gosh,
Please.
especially.
Please. Right?
Right?
Well, and I listened to your TEDx talk.
Oh,
Yes.
Which was so amazing. And the point that I really love to summarize it was the regrets that you summarized, the top 5 regrets that people
Yes.
have when they pass. And it's not what we think it is, like climbing Machu Picchu or, doing these big
you
bucket
should
list
list them.
things.
I don't know them off the top of my head.
I took a screenshot.
But they'll be in the show notes.
Yes.
Well,
They will be now.
Yeah, from
Mental
your
note.
experience.
Eric is like, thanks for giving me more labor.
Yay.
No, it's totally fine. That's great.
We'll send you the bill.
I owe you.
Don't you know you're paying to be on this?
Is this what this is what I had to
Get
pay
your
for?
foot out. Get your foot out.
Oh, man.
Got to recoup the cost.
But photos.
Oh, foot photos. Everyone's gonna be like, what are they talking about? Anyway, to be seen. Yeah, like those regrets, right? It's all about just like, I wish I would have spent more time with my family.
Yeah.
Like, and it's interesting when my grandma was dying. So she had received essentially like a palliative care diagnosis. And with cancer, it had come back, I think, for a third time. Opted to she told us, I am not doing that treatment again. Like, it is my time. I'm just going to live it out to the end. And it was like it wasn't a beautiful death. It was a beautiful way to live. Like, it was just so wonderful. And I, one of the days, it was actually July 1st, and I went and spent the day with her, and she didn't die till the October. And so she was fine. She was at home, and I was like, Grandma, can I do an interview with you and ask these questions? And I had these 10 questions to ask her, just on kind of like the meaning of life and like looking back, especially knowing that, the end was coming, and just her basically reiterating these like regrets of the dying, but not her regrets, but just her advice about like, people don't judge you by how clean your home is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's about the, the memories that you make. And it was just so powerful to hear that from her, because, she always, like, we all got some of our tendencies from our grandma, where it's like clean house, minimal thing. Like, there's a group of us, like all of us cousins, like we are all the same. You go into all of our homes, it's all the same. It's, passed down through generational.
Yes.
And, but then to sit with her and hear, the things that maybe we held on to as a badge of honor, to hear the matriarch be like,
Not that
not
big of a
not
deal.
important.
Yeah.
Was pretty profound, but it just was validating that, like, what does matter at the end of life. And I think that that's something that we can all think about, like what is going to matter. And I think so many of us put so much effort and work into the things that don't matter. And we allow the noise of others' expectations like to drown out like our inner knowing. And I just, my wish for all of us is that we just pause, go inside, figure out what's important, live our life for ourselves, not for all of the expectations. And then, you know, support others as they do that. Right? Because it's one thing to do it for yourself, but like it's a really lonely world when you're not supported by those who are supposed to care the most about you.
So how do you drown out the noise?
Oh my God. How do I? Medication. Right? Lexapro's my friend. But really, like, you know, helping treat the anxiety was huge for me.
Yeah.
But also I think it's about like, it's really placing the value into the relationships that mean the most to me. I think it's really easy to get caught up in like doing all of the things and being all of the things and being everywhere, when actually it's like, you know, my time is my most valuable resource.
Yes.
It is non-renewable.
Yes.
It is finite.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so what do I want to do with my time? And I hope I have a lot of time left, but we just don't know.
No.
And so sometimes I'll be like, will I regret having sat on the floor and played with my boys in my really messy house? Probably not.
Never.
No, I had that idea last night as I was cleaning my kitchen table because my kids were playing. And since Christmas, we probably play Uno because my son got it like every night.
It's so good.
Uno's
It's like
so fun.
You know what? Any parents, you need Uno because everyone can play it. And it's actually like very entertaining
And
as
numbers
a parent.
and colors.
Numbers, colors,
Yeah.
pattern, like switching
Yes.
things up. It's really helping my kids like focus. Like I'm like, you have to focus on the game. It's actually really good. And as an adult who doesn't do imaginative play because my imagination died somewhere along the way, this is great way for me to spend time with my kids. So Uno, sponsor us. Whoever Hasbro, did Hasbro do that game? I don't know.
We
Probably.
could try.
My point is that as I was like getting ready to do Uno, because my 4-year-old's like jumping around asking, I was like cleaning the house and I like had this moment where I was like, oh, it just like doesn't matter if my house is clean. Like, I was like, it really doesn't matter. Like, yeah, put the food away because that's kind of gross. But I was like, my kids' papers that are everywhere. I'm like, it really doesn't matter. Like in the grand scheme of everything, I'm like, I think I watch everyone on Instagram do these like nightly resets, which is great. And I'm like, wow, your house looks so nice. But I'm like, I just don't have it in me at the end of the night after I've done all this other stuff and after I've spent time with my kids to now like go and like make sure my house is clean for what?
Yeah.
While we're all asleep?
Yeah.
So that when we wake up in the morning, they all like mess it up again. Like I'm like,
I think the question is always like, who are you doing it for?
yeah,
Ooh, that's such
yeah.
a good question.
And so if you're doing it for yourself,
Yes.
if you know that you will sleep better
That's
and have a
good.
better
Yes.
morning with a clean kitchen, like that's me.
Yes.
I have to do it. But if you're doing it because you think you should, then like stop. You know, play Uno. The same thing. It's like this whole role of like mother. That's a whole other conversation. And being a woman. But it's like, you know what? Like I'm a better mother and I'm a better everything when I do something for myself.
Yes.
And so I practice on like dropping the guilt that like my time, I need to spend it with other people. I need to do other things. I deserve to do other things. And my time is as valuable as any other person in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I should clarify, I'm not knocking anyone who does the nightly resets.
No, I know.
But I think it's the comparison game that happens.
Yes.
Is I'm like, they're all doing it, so I should do it
Yes.
because now I'm less than because I woke up and my crock pot is dirty from chili last night.
Yeah.
And it will be chili until Nick, or chili, it will be dirty until Nick cleans it.
Or CJ comes over.
or CJ comes over.
Well, I think it's
So,
like
right?
if it's good for your mental health because it will make
Yeah.
you feel better,
Yeah.
then do it.
the
right?
distinction.
But if it's like, oh, I should do this because I should do the 5-minute morning routine or whatever it is, if that doesn't work for you or align with what works for you, then that's fine.
And like also, it's not just on the mother to do the nightly reset.
Yeah.
And
Agreed.
that's also all we see, right? It's like,
Yeah.
so no, like we have to, like, again, it's
Preach.
it's about our time.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
about our time. And like, why is it that like we put our time, you know, into doing all of it? Like we can do everything and do this. And
Yeah.
it's like, no, like my time is as valuable
well,
as
it's like
anyone
if I
else's.
have time to do 5 minutes for me at the end of the day, then I will. But like Erica said, then I'm just too tired to do it. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to do it.
Well, and you know, my husband and I actually just had a bit of a discussion because the rule in our house is the person who makes supper doesn't do dishes.
Yep.
Right? Like that. I love that rule.
Totally.
Great rule.
I make dinner a lot. So it's his job to do the dishes. And I was getting very annoyed because I would go to bed and the dishes wouldn't be done. And he'd be like, I mean, I go to bed pretty early, so I'd be like, why aren't the dishes done? And
he's like still eating supper with the kids.
He's literally still eating supper. And I'm like, what is happening?
Grandma's ready for
I'm
bed.
like, Grandma's ready for bed. No. So we had this discussion though, because I was very angry and I was like, you let it sit out and you do this. And I'm like, I'm cooking. And I was definitely taking on the, like, I do all these things. And then we had a very open discussion where he was like, I prefer to do the dishes like right before I go to bed. He's like, I turn on my like thing in my ears, whatever he's listening to or watching. He's like, and my brain is dead. So doing the dishes is very monotonous and I can just like do it and then like go to bed. And so I loved having that discussion because it gave me the freedom to stop pestering him, because I was like, he'll do it and he'll do it in his way. And I do think sometimes as mom and as women, like I'm totally on board that women and mothers, like that's a whole thing, that's a whole role. But I see that sliver of like, am I asking him to do something on my time and the way I want to do it, and then I'm not happy with it? Like, you know,
listen, there was that meme. I mean, there's a million memes. Like there's that meme, that singular
that
one,
the motherhood one.
Yes. But the one motherhood one,
The only one.
Like, but it's like every wife where it's like, hey, can you help me move this? And because they don't do it immediately, like the wife like leaps up and like huffing, puffing.
Yeah.
Like that is me.
Yes.
I was like, oh, you're in my house. Like, and my husband was also like, oh, look at you.
He's sending it to you daily.
Right? It's like constantly being like, see, like I'll get to it. But it is like, it's our timeline. And the other point too is like, we have to then voice our timeline.
Yes.
So, you know, they, whoever it is, the expectation piece of like, hey, I really need help with this. Sure. Okay. Well, we've passed it over. Not versus like, hey, I need this done by 7.
Yeah. Well, and I had to reflect because like my husband would never walk in. He's wonderful. He would never walk in and be like, why isn't supper on the table at 5:30? No. He'd walk in and be like, just let me know what time we're eating and you know, we're good. So I had to be like, maybe I just have to be good with knowing he'll do it and like leave it at that. Yep. And now I can go to bed and be like, if you want to stay up till midnight doing that, like that's you, dude. Like you go for it, right?
My sister gave me advice a long time ago in relation to parenting and or living with somebody, right? And it's like, if you want somebody to do something for you, you have to let them do it in their own way, right? Like, so use the dishes as an example. If you ask them to do the dishes, but they don't do the dishes the exact same way you do the dishes, is it mean it's wrong or is it done?
Yeah.
Right? So what's more important, that they do it your way or that they do it?
Right. And I think that these are the conversations that like when we start reflecting more on our time and what that's like in our life and what it means, we will lean into those conversations more. But when we look at our time as like infinite, whatever, I'll get to it, I'm responsible for all of it, like whatever that looks like, then we just let things go or we let it pass or we hold on to resent. There's no time for resent. There's, you know, we have to lean into those hard conversations. And like, that is what like, you know, going back to like grief and loss and doing that work has really done for me is like, we have to have these hard conversations and you have to have them now or you have to let them go. And, you know, that whole piece of forgiveness is like another whole conversation, but you know, forgiveness is also about like letting ourselves off the hook. Yeah. Just as much as it's not saying, hey, what you did was wrong. And I have to say that what your wrong behavior was okay. It's just being like, you know what? I can't carry this anymore. Yeah. So I'm going to let it go. Yeah. You know, sometimes that's also what forgiveness is about, is just being like, I don't want to carry around this weight anymore.
Yeah. Because it truly is a weight, right?
Yeah, it's a weight.
So it's very heavy. Oh, you guys, we're coming to the end of our time already. No.
That was like wildly fast.
Time. Like speed dating.
I know. You gave us so much good information though. Thank you so much for coming.
It was grief and fun.
It was grief. I love that. That was grief and fun.
Grief and fun.
But we do have one wrap-up question that we like to ask our listeners. But we've actually, guys, we're changing it up. It's a new question.
Damn it.
Yeah. No,
she's like, know it.
Red.
Darn it.
You can still tell us if you want.
No, we'd love to know, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
There's so much of it, but I always think back, if this is so funny, is my dad when I was like moving away to university. And like, I couldn't decide if I wanted to move to Toronto or stay closer to home. And like 17-year-old me was really struggling with this. And, I'll never forget. And my dad is a man of like little words, but 100% support. And we were like at this kitchen table and he's like, Lisa, like when you're 55, are you going to look back and be like, damn, I should have went to Toronto? Or are you going to be like, I went, I didn't like it, and I moved home because home's always here? He's like, so you have, he's like, it's okay to, make a decision based on like, when you look back, what is the thing that you're going to be the happiest that you made?
Yeah.
And like, it was like in that moment, it was like, well, I'm going. He's like, of course. And if you hate it, you come home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm
Absolutely.
And that's okay.
and
That's not
okay.
a failure.
It's not a failure.
Yeah.
It's just like, why wouldn't you try? Why wouldn't you go? Why wouldn't you do? Like, that's what this is about. And so that has always stuck with me with like, kind of the, like, why not?
And permission to change your mind.
Yep.
That's a big one.
That
was a good one. I did dad advice too on my podcast.
Did
I'm
you?
like, dads, they've got really good advice.
I know, right? When they decide to like share.
And talk.
Oh, my dad is a mediator. So like I get advice. I got a book that I could
talker.
write. Yeah, he's coming on the podcast.
Oh, that's fun.
Literally. We were like,
So fun.
So I love that you shared what your dad said, because I think there's so much wisdom that we can pull from our parents.
Absolutely.
I love that. Well, let's tell the people where to find you, your social handles, website. We'll link it all out, but where can people find you?
So like Instagram's probably the best. So it's just at Lisa Greig Wellness.
Which you've been pumping out the great content lately.
Oh, you have.
So I'm like, I just need to stop for a second and give you a shout out and say everyone needs to go follow you.
Absolutely.
Because
thank
the
you.
advice, tips, those like what you're sharing is so valuable.
And can you spell it? Because
Yes.
it's Lisa Greig.
But it's not spelled that way.
It's like I before E, except in Greg. It's like
Oh my gosh, I was always going to stick my head down.
So it's like Lisa and then GREIG Wellness. Yeah.
Awesome.
So
And
good.
what is the title of your book and where can we find it? Your children's book.
Yes, it's Scream Shout, Let's Feel Our Grief Out. And you can order it directly through me on Instagram, or you can find it in McNally Robinson.
Oh, amazing.
In Saskatoon. Love that.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes, they're amazing for supporting local authors.
They really are.
love
Yeah,
that.
they
Which
really
is
are.
great. Independent bookstores are fantastic.
Yes.
Amazing. Okay, well, we'll
grab your
have to have you
copy.
back because we definitely have other topics that we
Yes.
brought up today
So
that we'd
good.
love to discuss with you. But yeah, thank you so much for being here with us
Thank
today.
you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you everyone for joining us on this episode of the Her Podcast. If you want to follow along with us, you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at its.her.podcast. We can't wait to see you there.
Bye.
Adios.